Emblem's legacy began all the way back on the NES, or sorry, the Famicom. And while its premier entry is essentially the progenitor of strategy RPGs, there was clearly work to be done, rules that needed to be defined. Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, as well as Fire Emblem Gaiden, were two halves of what I ultimately view as a trial run. A lot of their flaws were blemishes that only arose by way of being the first of their kind. This type of game simply needed more time to cook, and perhaps more technology to make it all work smoother. Enter the Super Famicom, a brand new console with 8 whole extra bits to work with were exactly what the doctor ordered when it came to pushing the envelope for RPGs, let alone Fire Emblem. And yes, specifically on the Super Famicom, as none of this generation's titles have officially made it overseas in any capacity. But fans translated them anyway, link in the description, and they haven't been able to stop talking about them since. Except for the first of the bunch, apparently. To kick off the series' next-gen debut in 1994, Fire Emblem Mystery of the Emblem released as the third entry and provided players with a double feature. Book 1 is an abridged remake of Fire Emblem 1, and Book 2 is a proper narrative sequel to Marth's first adventure, as well as the next conflict within Archanea. A game in this vein should be pretty attractive for anyone curious about the series' origins, yet I barely ever hear a word about it. What's going on? Is it bad? I don't know about you, but even if I wasn't doing this series retrospective, I would have been awfully curious to look into the game nobody talks about before the one everyone likes and the one everyone fears. Just what are those mysteries of the emblem, and what does this era of the series have in store for us? Let's get into it, starting with that first book. For the Book 1 portion of this game review, we're going to be specifically talking about how good of a job it does at being a remake, let alone if it's worth playing with the original as a constant option. Starting with the things that didn't change, there's the story, which may have a few extra bells and whistles, but is more or less the same. And if you don't already know what FE1's story is, let me quickly break it down for you. Prince Marth got his kingdom taken over by the evil wizard Garnith, his sister kidnapped, and a shadow dragon of sorts, on its way to being revived. Find the magical sword, or a blade of light if you will, save your sister, defeat that wizard creep, and seal away the draconic beast in order to reclaim the continent Archanea. That's the plot, and if it feels like I'm cutting corners, no I'm not, the story really is that simple. But being a remake of an 8-bit RPG released in 1990, I was okay with it there, and I'm okay with it here. FE1 wasn't trying to have a blatant text-heavy narrative anyway, although I appreciate this remake's additional pre-battle text and in-game world map, and the opening cutscene working to flesh out Archanea for both books. It's nice to get more of the details without having to look at the game's manual, especially when I'm experiencing it years later on my emulator. Yes, Nintendo, on my emulator. I'll buy the game if you want to sell it to me in English, but until that day comes, thank you fans, and thank you unrecruited berserkers. As you can see, the original narrative still takes a backseat to the gameplay, remaining the primary manner in which story beats go down. And while preparing for those battles is a much better process overall, you still can't see where your units will deploy until the battle actually starts. 3 games in, it's starting to feel like a deliberate choice, one I strongly disagree with. What feels like a genuine oversight though is the fact that you can't see units or enemies attack range. I didn't mind it in FE1 since attack range was capped at 2 anyway, but it got a lot more annoying in Gaiden with archers and witches, and it's even worse here because of Balliste getting their sniping capabilities, as well as the new tomes, Worm and Meteor. I've never been crazy about these sniper attacks, with this game being one of their worst incarnations. Not only are they pretty damn strong here, but every ballista unit of yours got cut despite some characters getting moved to other chapters, meaning you never get to use them yourself, and the enemies get an unfair advantage. Oh, and speaking of, ambush spawns are still here. Yay. On a much brighter note, that covers all the persisting issues. Everything else was pretty much fixed. For one, you can see your movement range now. Makes the exclusion of attack range even weirder, but hey, no more counting spaces. And speaking of no more counting, the game now calculates your attack strength and attack speed in a new battle forecast. So while you'll still have to subtract defense from the given number to know the true damage, as well as check your attack speed against the enemies to make sure you'll double, the process has been conveniently streamlined. Then mages technically use the strength stat to up their magic damage, but it's functionally the same as a proper magic stat, so they've been better implemented into the battle system as well, along with their magical adjacent class, healers. They no longer come with an attack tome, but actually gain experience by doing the thing they're supposed to do, healing. It's about time. Now I don't look crazy for calling them one of my favorite classes. They're officially great, and Lena is just the beginning of the healer takeover. Above everything though, item management has finally finally been brought up to the series standard. Units can properly trade with each other, Marth has constant access to the convoy, and that convoy can be navigated prior to battle by anyone. It's a hell of an improvement, with both weapons and items having their own storage space per character, giving you a lot more room to work with. Maybe even a bit too much, but after the last two games, I think I'll just keep my mouth shut. With a smoother UI comes smoother battles, coupled with quicker loading times and snappier animations. Even though the game only looks decent in its own right, that 16-bit coat of paint is very much apparent when compared to the original. The character portraits, sprites within battles, and their proper backgrounds are a lot more impressive than these goobers in the ever-looming void, at least. Besides, if you're not really impressed with what you're seeing, then you might as well turn off this crap like me and save yourself literal hours. This might be the best addition outside of actual inventory management, and is my preferred way to play every Fire Emblem game once I've seen everything I want to, with very advanced exceptions. The only downside to this is that you won't see which of your stats rise upon level ups. You'll either keep track of that on your own or try and figure it out during combat, which was an annoyance that I eventually learned to deal with. A small UI element to go with these is all it really needs. With the better visuals comes a better soundtrack as well. And as a bigger fan of the Super Famicom sound chip than the standard Famicom, I naturally like Book 1's OST more than the already great one in the original. Together We Ride especially was already fantastic in the original and might just sound even better here. Unfortunately, the new rendition of the player phase theme gives me heavy PTSD for Fire Emblem Heroes, so I guess the soundtrack automatically gets a 0 out of 10. A shame, really. So, remake or rebreak? I've gotta say, I'm impressed with how Book 1 reimagines the FE1 experience. A lot of that original game's issues have been ironed out by way of the team having a better idea and understanding of what a strategy game should look like, let alone a Fire Emblem game. Yet even still, the quality of life changes and additions fail to compromise those aspects that made the original special, with some serving to strengthen them even further. Remember, FE1 is secretly pretty good underneath a lot of old school jank, so now that said jank is gone, we can properly appreciate the game and all it sets out to do. Everything that was optional once before still is here, maps work a bit better due to updated enemy AI and mechanics, non-physical units are properly balanced, and the game runs a lot quicker thanks to the advanced technology. On top of this, you can still get silly with the game, but the challenges you'll be working around feel so much more intentional. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a net positive experience to me, with the only plausible exceptions to this being a new dismounting mechanic and the omission of a few chapters and characters. Dismounting should be pretty self-explanatory for mounted units, and it would have been something I ignored entirely, but the game forces it onto you whenever you have to travel indoors or if there's an indoor map. And one of those indoor chapters is the last one. How am I supposed to god mode sheet up my way out of these? I don't like this, and Book 1 especially wasn't designed around limiting cavaliers in this manner. It's the one true blemish this remake introduces that wasn't seen in the original, meaning that no, I actually don't care about the cut maps and characters. The former felt superfluous to the original game's pacing anyway, or I just didn't like them, with the same being applicable to the latter. Minus the ballista units, you still have a crap ton of options to compensate for permadeath, with the more prominent figures all being here in accounted for. Pour one out for Reese fans though. So minus dismounting, unless you really need to play those missions and see the original experience in its absolute purest, there's no reason to play FE1 over FE3 Book 1. I actually finished this before FE1, and this was the game that not only inspired me to go back even further, but do this whole retrospective. Now having played both in full, I can confidently say that this is as far back as you'll ever need to go, and for my money, is where the series got its true start. Truthfully, I find myself struggling to even call it a remake at the end of the day. It feels more like a redo, as it's a better introduction to the series, keeps a lot of the original game's design mentalities intact, and doesn't even feel like it attempts to add anything too game-changing to the experience. Maybe I'm looking too deep into it, but I hope that works to emphasize how great Book 1 is overall, and I'm glad it was a key component to making Mystery of the Emblem on the whole what it is. But how about that second book? Well, for starters, the plot this time around is a bit more involved. Archanea has been at peace after 2 years of restoration following the War of Shadows, with Hardin ascending the throne. Hardin? Who? Oh, Hardin! That Cavalier dude I used in FE1. Sorry, I didn't really use him when I first played Book 1. I was committed to using one of the Christmas Cavaliers for that class. But good for him. Anyway, all seems well throughout the kingdoms until Hardin's military begins to occupy lands by force, with Marth and his army being forced to comply or be branded as traitors to the kingdom. It doesn't take long to realize that Hardin isn't the man he once was, with his demands and aggression causing the start of the War of Heroes. The continent is torn apart by strife yet again, and it's up to Marth to not only rise up to another challenge, but get to the bottom of what made Hardin this way, maybe coming face to face with some old friends in the process, making for a much more interesting narrative to follow. This story is kinda baller, with the lands of Archanea getting fleshed out even further by way of once unseen lands and interesting lore. Lore that occasionally was dished out in a boring text-dumpy manner, but interesting lore nevertheless. And just to knock out the negatives, I do think this kind of conflict would have hit a lot harder if FE1's cast was more blatantly characterized, as their roles in the story are still gameplay reliant. But because it happens to be an effective method for someone like me, I was able to remain invested and had to make some tough calls when I didn't know how to recruit certain characters. Old and new faces still gave the narrative proper impact, paving the way for fire scenarios unique to my playthrough and an experience just as memorable as the one preceding it. No, not that one. And for the record, a few characters did get to be more story relevant within the second book, which was pretty cool to see. Gaiden becoming Marth's advisor was a believable progression for his character, and Marth himself had a lot more to say this time, which made him an even cooler anime swordsman. Then Sheeta, Lind, Merrick, Minerva, Tiki, Julian, and Sirius ended up as my favorites, with Hardin being a neat villain as well. He pushed the conflict forward and turned to the dark side by way of giving into his flaws and insecurities that showcased the depth behind what would otherwise be just another unit. We're clearly starting to get to a point where these games have properly fleshed out stories on their surface, with the War of Heroes being a pretty good start to this trend. As evident by the plot synopsis, Book 2 on the whole takes a lot more advantage of the Super Famicom's capabilities to provide an experience that may not have been possible on the Famicom. Better looking maps, backgrounds, monsters, and a superior OST that progresses with you as your journey continues all make for a much grander game in scope. Yet even with the 16-bit coat of paint, I define it more in line with how an 8-bit RPG is designed. It's someone in that transitional period, kind of like how Phantasy Star 2 was, for example. Sure, there's a higher production value, but the biggest story beats will still happen by way of the player's playthrough, characters won't talk that much more than they would have with half the bits, and there's a cryptic nature to a few of the game's secrets you probably weren't meant to figure out unless outside resources were taken into consideration. All of this made sense with Book 1, but was kinda surprising to see in Book 2, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's quite the opposite, with Book 2 taking advantage of those classic design choices intentionally rather than working within limitations. As a result, those cool optional events that you could find in FE1 have been expanded upon in exciting ways, empowering the player experience overall. Even the simple act of recruiting characters has gotten more interesting. You can't always have Marth use his protagonist power reserve Sheeta her feminine charms. They can recruit some units, sure, but the majority of them require you to figure out their more interpersonal relationships outside of the main two, which alone characterizes them that slightest bit further. And in terms of additional gameplay elements to serve your experience, there are a lot more unique items to help with class niches and some powerful tools you have to work extra hard to receive, with the objectives to do so strengthening the game's map design. That warp staff I love so much, it's thankfully still here, and even brought a friend. The rescue staff. Take the concept and reverse it. Far away units can be brought to an adjacent tile, making for clutch saves or some crazy movement strategies. To the shock of no one, I love this thing too, and like the warp staff, it's got infinite range, baby. I'm telling you, man, healers are so cool now. Welcome to the sweep, Yulia. Then there are the orb fragments, pieces of the once whole star sphere you'll have to find in a game-spanning treasure hunt. Each one raises growths for various stats, and getting all of them is a requirement for the true ending. So it's not only a fun side quest, but immediately rewarding in that they can be used to better build your units. That of which being more rewarding to do thanks to the return of a linear chapter-by-chapter progression. And yes, your boy took some notes for these as well. I didn't feel like having another tab open. While I'm generally mixed on the idea of true endings, this is an instance where the inclusion was an enhancer, working to reinforce the player's agency and incentivize replays. So if it wasn't already clear, the Super Famicom era will be when you realize how silly Kaga Emblem can get with the options it provides to the player. That's even sillier than the Famicom duology. However, this is also the era most aware of how many silly options you have, with Book 2 cranking up the difficulty further than we've ever seen out to this point. It is tough, throwing promoted enemy units at you as early as Chapter 2, and you're expected to just deal with it. The game's maps have definitely gotten a lot bolder, which makes sense. It's safe to assume that if you're playing Book 2, you've at least played Book 1 or FE1, and with that experience, I found myself relishing in the greater sense of challenge, along with the difficulties that came from trying to go for extras and secrets. For the most part, challenge in Book 2 comes by way of more testing layouts and enemy placement, with the early game only having one glaring exception. But then those exceptions start to pile on a bit, with later maps losing the plot of what made the game's challenge so satisfying to overcome in favor of just throwing a crap ton of enemies at the player. Admittedly, this is a problem with a lot of Fire Emblem games, and thankfully it remains the exception instead of the norm, but it still stood out here because of how front heavy it was, often starting off chapters with a cluster of foes to deal with. Furthermore, Book 2 surprisingly reused a few maps from FE1, including some of the ones that were cut and a few that were just playable in Book 1. Yeah, this is lame. It would have been a cool trick once or twice, but a much larger ratio was spent in familiar territory than I found necessary, and I'd rather have seen some fresh ideas. Finally, dismounting is still lame, even in the part of the game that should have been designed around it. Go figure, am I right? All of that said, these flaws never frustrated me in a manner that completely compromised my enjoyment. And for what it's worth, the game got its act together in the end, housing a very strong latent endgame. If anything, the game just forced me to think a bit differently every now and then, with both books managing to be satisfying on their own, and even stronger in tandem. This is basically 2 games in one, but the overarching experience makes for a strategy RPG epic, somehow squished into one cartridge. Something I'm still impressed by, especially considering the series standing at this point in time and the ways Mystery pushed it all forward. This game sets a new standard entirely. The improvements it makes, story tropes it lays out, and the gameplay philosophies it presents to the player all make a much stronger foundation for the series moving forward. Combined with how it introduces a better way of playing the original game, it should be clear why I define it as the true start of the franchise. But to then push the design mentality of a Fire Emblem game in a way that nudges the player to become more acquainted with its systems in the same package, that's a feat reserved for a sequel. The fact that it's all on one cartridge is more than enough proof that a better understanding of the series' own identity was reached, making for my favorite Nintendo series' first uncompromised banger. Mystery of the Emblem is Fire Emblem finally realizing its potential, and I really don't understand why it's so overlooked. Okay, knowing what comes next, maybe I have a bit of an idea, but don't let that get in the way of experiencing the Super Famicom's first foray into the series' greatness. Anyone curious about its most classic titles owes it to themselves to check this out, being a great start to a bold new era for this fantastic tactics series. And obviously, that ain't no mystery.